Karoline Leavitt settled into her first-class seat, adjusting the small gold cross necklace that rested just above her collarbone. The hum of boarding passengers filled the cabin as travelers stowed their luggage and settled in for the flight. It was supposed to be a routine trip, nothing out of the ordinary. But just as she got comfortable, a flight attendant approached. Her stiff smile and overly polite demeanor signaling that this wasn't just a casual greeting. At first, Karoline assumed it was a simple offer of water or a menu, but the attendant's eyes weren't on her. They were locked onto the cross around her neck. "Miss, we like to keep the atmosphere welcoming for everyone," the attendant said, her tone light but unmistakably pointed. "Some passengers might find that a bit inappropriate." Karoline blinked, caught off guard by the remark. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant's expression remained neutral, but there was a tension in her posture, a quiet insistence behind her words. "We just try to avoid displays that could make others uncomfortable," she continued, her voice carrying the polished smoothness of someone who had done this before, someone who expected compliance without argument. Karoline's grip on the armrest tightened slightly. A display? It was a necklace, nothing more. And yet, the underlying message was clear. This wasn't a polite suggestion. It was a demand wrapped in the illusion of customer service. The surrounding passengers, many of whom had been focused on their phones or quietly reading, began to notice the exchange. A hush fell over the section as a few curious glances were exchanged. Someone discreetly tilted their phone, the faint glint of a camera lens catching the light. The weight of the moment settled over Karoline as she realized what was happening. This wasn't just about airline policy, and it certainly wasn't about passenger comfort. It was about something else entirely, and it was a test. Karoline straightened in her seat, keeping her voice clear but unwavering. "Are you telling me that wearing a cross is making people uncomfortable?" she asked, making sure her words were loud enough for others to hear. The flight attendant's smile didn't waver, but the slight shift in her stance betrayed her unease. "I'm just asking for cooperation, Miss Leavitt," she replied, deliberately using her full name. The intentional name drop confirmed what Karoline had already suspected. This wasn't random. The attendant knew exactly who she was. Passengers around them shifted in their seats, the quiet murmur of whispers filling the space. A businessman in the row across leaned forward slightly, watching intently. A woman 2 seats back adjusted her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen as if deciding whether to start recording. The tension in the cabin thickened. Then, just as Karoline was about to respond, a soft chime rang overhead. Someone had pressed the flight attendant call button. A new voice entered the conversation, deep and steady from 2 rows back. "She's right," the man said. "You wouldn't say this to someone wearing another religious symbol." The murmur of whispers grew louder. The air in the cabin seemed to tighten, the weight of collective scrutiny settling over the flight attendant, who now found herself in a situation far bigger than she had intended. For the first time, her composure faltered. The moment had shifted, and now it was no longer just about Karoline. It was about something much bigger. The air inside the cabin grew heavier, thick with an unspoken tension that no one had anticipated at the start of the flight. Karoline Leavitt, still seated but now fully engaged, met the flight attendant's gaze without flinching. "Are you saying religious jewelry is against airline policy?" she asked, her voice calm but firm, refusing to be brushed aside. The attendant hesitated for the first time, her polished authority wavering ever so slightly. "It's not about policy," she finally admitted, her voice quieter now. "It's about keeping the atmosphere comfortable for everyone." That was it. Karoline had her answer. This wasn't about a rule, a regulation, or an official company stance. It was personal, it was selective, and it was targeted. The passengers around them, no longer pretending not to listen, sat in stiff silence, their attention split between Karoline and the attendant. The moment stretched as if the whole plane had collectively stopped breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. The businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with open disapproval. A woman across the aisle shook her head, her lips pressed together in frustration. The once quiet murmurs had grown into something more. A low, rolling wave of discontent, the kind that couldn't be ignored. And then, the inevitable happened. Another passenger, a younger man sitting in business class, turned toward the flight attendant. "That doesn't sound right," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "People wear religious symbols all the time. Are you asking anyone else to take theirs off?" The question hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The attendant, clearly uncomfortable now, shifted on her feet. Her fingers curled slightly against the edge of her serving tray, the tension showing in the small, involuntary movements of someone who knew they had lost control of the moment but wasn't ready to admit it. "Look, I'm trying to keep this from becoming a problem," she said, her voice tightening. "If you could just—" "She's not the one making it a problem," the businessman interrupted. His voice was steady, unshaken, but the weight behind it made an impact. "You are—" The words landed like a gavel. A few passengers exchanged glances. The flight crew had taken notice now. Another attendant, wearing the distinguished stripes of a lead supervisor, approached from the front of the cabin. She stopped next to her colleague, scanning the scene before glancing toward Karoline. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked, her voice professional but measured. The first attendant, seizing the opportunity to reframe the situation, straightened her posture. "Miss Leavitt's necklace is causing discomfort for some passengers," she explained quickly, as if that would be enough to settle the matter. But the supervisor's expression barely shifted. Instead, she turned her gaze to Karoline's cross, then back to the flight attendant. A long pause followed, and in that silence, the realization became clear. There was no actual rule to enforce here, and now the entire situation was spiraling into a controversy. A passenger in the row behind them tilted their phone up just enough for the camera lens to peek over the seat. Someone else whispered to their companion, the tone unmistakably incredulous. The moment had outgrown itself, expanding beyond a simple request into something far larger than the flight crew had anticipated. The supervisor, clearly weighing her options, finally turned back to Karoline. "You're welcome to wear your necklace, Miss Leavitt," she said, simply, her tone neutral but firm. It was over. The first flight attendant's face drained of color. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but seemed to realize there was no point. The murmurs in the cabin turned into something else entirely, a low ripple of approval. Passengers nodding, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just transpired, and then a voice from across the aisle, louder than the rest. "So you really tried to police someone's faith in first class?" The tension didn't ease. It transformed. If anything, it tightened like a rope being pulled from both ends. Karoline kept her posture firm, her gaze steady, locking eyes with the attendant who had tried to single her out. The power had shifted, and there was no reversing it now. This wasn't just an awkward in-flight moment. It was about to become something much bigger. The shift in power was undeniable. The first flight attendant, who had moments ago carried herself with quiet authority, now stood frozen in place, her lips pressed into a thin, rigid line as the weight of the situation fully settled onto her shoulders. The murmurs throughout the cabin were no longer whispers of curiosity. They were declarations of discontent. Passengers who had once been passive observers were now leaning forward in their seats, shaking their heads, exchanging quiet words of frustration. The air in first class had transformed, no longer just a setting for a pre-fleet disagreement, but a stage for something far greater. And then, as if to solidify the gravity of the moment, a phone camera tilted just high enough to catch the attendant's face, its lens reflecting the weight of an audience that would soon expand far beyond the confines of the plane. Karoline remained composed, her posture unwavering, her hands calmly resting on her lap. She wasn't the one who had escalated this. She had simply refused to comply. And now, the consequences of that refusal were playing out before everyone in real time. The lead supervisor, now fully aware of how fragile the situation had become, attempted to reassert control. "Miss Leavitt," she said with a careful nod, her voice professional but lacking its earlier certainty, "I apologize for any misunderstanding. You are free to wear your cross." But the words, while correct, came too late. The damage had already been done. The flight attendant who had initiated the confrontation shifted uncomfortably, her jaw tightening as she glanced around the cabin, perhaps realizing for the first time that the response she had expected, silent compliance, was not what she had received. And then, just as the moment seemed to reach its peak, A man 2 rows back leaned forward, raising his voice just enough to be heard across the cabin. "This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. "People wear religious symbols all the time, but she gets targeted?" The statement was met with nods of agreement, the passengers now engaged in open discussion. A woman across the aisle scoffed audibly, muttering, "First class doesn't mean first-class treatment, huh?" Another voice chimed in, sharper this time, carrying an unmistakable edge of indignation. If she weren't conservative, would this even be happening? The flight crew had lost control. What had started as an isolated exchange between a passenger and an attendant had now turned into a full-scale controversy unfolding at 300 feet. The first attendant, visibly uncomfortable, took a small step back, as if trying to physically remove herself from the situation, but it was no use. Another phone was lifted discreetly over a seat back, capturing her stiff expression as the backlash continued to build. She could feel the heat of the moment pressing down on her, the realization sinking in that she had miscalculated, not just with Karoline, but with the passengers around her, who were no longer willing to stay silent. The lead supervisor, sensing the irreversible damage, attempted to shift the focus. She turned to Karoline, offering what should have been a gesture of reconciliation. "Let's get you a drink, Miss Leavitt, on the house." The words were carefully chosen, a subtle attempt to smooth over the incident, to push past it as if it were nothing more than a misunderstanding. But it wasn't, and everyone in the cabin knew it. The offer, rather than diffusing the situation, only emphasized how badly the flight crew had fumbled. Karoline didn't need their free drink. She had already won. But the real victory was happening beyond the immediate moment. She could feel it in the way passengers glanced at her with quiet nods of approval, in the way the recording phones remained steady, capturing everything, and in the way the flight attendant who had tried to call her out now stood motionless, her hands clenched into tight fists. She knew, just as Karoline did, that this wasn't over. By the time the plane landed, this wouldn't just be an uncomfortable memory, it would be something far bigger. Something they could no longer contain. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but something far more powerful was unfolding beyond the confines of first class. As the flight continued at 300 feet, the internet had already taken notice. A chime rang through the cabin, signaling that the airline's in-flight Wi-Fi had just gone live, and almost immediately, a ripple of notifications buzzed across passengers' phones. It didn't take long before the first clips of the confrontation surfaced online. A short, less-than-a-minute video posted by a passenger to a conservative news page was gaining traction with astonishing speed. The caption was direct, pulling no punches. "Christian woman harassed mid-flight over her faith. You won't believe what happened next." The engagement was immediate. Likes, shares, and comments flooded in faster than the site's moderators could keep up with. Karoline glanced at her phone as the notifications began rolling in. She didn't need to post anything herself. The moment was already bigger than her. The video was speaking for itself, and the people watching it were making their voices heard. Comments poured in, filled with frustration, disbelief, and support. "This is what we're up against. They won't even let us exist in peace. Unreal. I hope this flight attendant gets what's coming to her. Karoline, you're a warrior. Stand strong." The momentum was unstoppable, a digital wave carrying the story far beyond the walls of the aircraft. Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had confronted Karoline was still moving stiffly through the aisle, her once authoritative presence now reduced to cautious, measured steps. She avoided eye contact, but the damage was already done. Across the aisle, another passenger subtly adjusted their phone's angle, making it obvious that the recording hadn't stopped. A woman a few rows back was typing furiously on her laptop, likely drafting the first of many articles that would break this story before the plane even landed. And then it happened. Within moments, larger media pages picked up the clip. News outlets, political commentators, and influencers with massive followings began sharing the footage, each adding their own take on what had just unfolded. Some framed it as another example of religious discrimination, others as proof of the double standard in modern discourse. But no matter the angle, one thing was undeniable. The story had taken on a life of its own. The flight crew, sensing the shift, had no choice but to keep their heads down and continue service. as if nothing had happened. The lead supervisor, who had earlier tried to smooth things over with a free drink offer, was now quietly speaking into a company-issued tablet, likely filing a report in a desperate attempt at damage control. But it was too late. The narrative had already been shaped not by the airline, not by the flight attendant, but by the passengers and the millions of people watching from their phones. By the time the plane touched down, the video had reached millions of views, and the debate had already begun. Some voices tried to downplay the moment, calling it a misunderstanding, while others defended Karoline's right to express her faith without interference. But no amount of spin could change what had happened. A flight attendant had tried to police a personal belief, and instead of silence, she had sparked something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. The plane had yet to land, but the fallout from the confrontation was already spiraling beyond the control of the airline. The flight attendant who had confronted Karoline was visibly shaken, her earlier confidence stripped away as she moved mechanically through the cabin, avoiding eye contact, her posture stiff with unease. She knew, just as everyone watching knew, that this wasn't just an awkward moment that would fade away once the flight ended. This was turning into a full-blown controversy. Meanwhile, Karoline remained composed, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing in around her. The energy in first class had shifted entirely. Passengers who had once been bystanders were now openly engaged, discussing what had just transpired. Some whispered to their seatmates, others kept their phones out, their screens flooded with live reactions from social media. The flight crew, recognizing the magnitude of what had unfolded, had adopted an air of cautious professionalism, but the damage was written all over their faces. Across the aisle, a man who had recorded the initial exchange scrolled through his notifications, nodding to himself as the clip continued to spread. "It's everywhere now," he muttered to no one in particular. A woman a few seats behind him had switched from watching to actively posting, her fingers flying across her screen as she contributed to the online discourse. Karoline's phone buzzed non-stop. The first major news outlets had already picked up the story, and more were joining by the minute. The flight attendant, now realizing the extent of the backlash, spoke in hushed tones with the lead supervisor, her demeanor tense. The supervisor, whose earlier attempt to smooth things over with a free drink had failed, was typing something rapidly into her company-issued tablet, likely drafting an internal report before the headlines got ahead of them, but it was too late. By the time the plane began its descent, the outside world had already taken hold of the narrative. Conservative commentators were rallying behind Karoline, using the incident as an example of what they saw as growing hostility toward religious expression. On the other side, some attempted to downplay it, calling it a misunderstanding, insisting that Karoline was overreacting. But the facts were clear, and the footage didn't lie. The airline's social media pages were already being flooded with demands for answers, customers calling out hypocrisy, questioning whether the flight attendant would face consequences. Meanwhile, Karoline sat back in her seat, glancing toward the woman who had tried to single her out. Their eyes didn't meet, but the flight attendant's stiff movements and clenched jaw spoke volumes. She understood what had happened now. She had underestimated the moment, and now, no matter how hard she tried to distance herself from it, this wasn't just a fleeting controversy. It was a cultural flashpoint that had already outgrown her. By the time Karoline Leavitt stepped off the plane, the incident had already outgrown its origins. What had started as an exchange between a flight attendant and a passenger had transformed into a national debate, a flashpoint in the ongoing cultural conversation about religious freedom, personal expression, and political bias. As Karoline walked through the terminal, her phone continued buzzing, a steady stream of notifications pouring in, news headlines, supportive messages, viral clips being shared across platforms. A stranger caught her eye, offering a small but knowing nod, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. Another passenger from the flight, someone who had witnessed the entire event firsthand, whispered as they passed, "We're with you." It was no longer just about a flight or a necklace. It had become something much bigger. On social media, the conversation was raging. Conservative figures championed Karoline as a symbol of resilience, holding up the incident as proof of what they saw as growing intolerance toward traditional values. "This is what happens when you stand firm," one post read, garnering thousands of likes. They tried to silence her, and instead, they made her voice louder than ever. News networks ran segments dissecting the situation, inviting legal analysts to weigh in on whether the airline had violated any policies or if this was part of a broader trend of discrimination. The airline itself had no choice but to acknowledge the situation. Their official account issued a carefully worded statement insisting they were conducting an internal review, but the damage had already been done. The public wasn't satisfied with vague corporate language. They wanted accountability. Meanwhile, liberal commentators attempted to reframe the incident, arguing that it had been blown out of proportion, that it was just a misunderstanding, but the footage told a different story. People had seen what happened, had heard the flight attendant's words, had watched as Karoline held her ground. The attempt to downplay the moment only fueled the divide, with both sides digging in further, turning the confrontation into a symbol of something much larger than itself. As the hours passed, the momentum didn't fade, it intensified. Karoline's inbox filled with interview requests, invitations to speak, even potential book offers. Figures who had once dismissed her as just another young conservative were now paying attention. She wasn't just someone who had stood her ground, she had become the face of a movement. The flight attendant, on the other hand, faced a very different reality. Anonymous airline employees leaked that she had been placed under review, though whether she would face any real consequences remained uncertain. This wasn't just about a single moment on a plane. It was about the broader cultural landscape, about who gets to express their beliefs openly and who is pressured into silence. Karoline hadn't asked to be at the center of this storm, but now that she was, there was no going back. The airline could attempt damage control, the media could try to spin the narrative, but the truth had already been broadcast to millions. And for many, that truth was undeniable. Standing firm in your beliefs, even in the face of pressure, could turn a single moment into a defining movement. The confrontation Karoline Leavitt faced on her flight was more than just a moment of conflict. It was a powerful lesson in standing firm for one's beliefs despite societal pressure. For older generations who have witnessed shifting cultural values, this story serves as a reminder that principles should not be compromised for the sake of convenience or acceptance. Over time, many have seen how society often discourages open expressions of faith, personal values, or traditional beliefs, framing them as outdated or controversial. Yet, history has proven that those who stand strong in their convictions, even in the face of adversity, shape the world around them far more than those who remain silent. This moment underscores the importance of courage in everyday life. Whether it is in personal relationships, workplaces, or community spaces, there will always be situations where one is subtly or overtly pressured to conform, to blend in, or to suppress deeply held values. But dignity comes from knowing that standing firm does not require hostility or aggression. It requires quiet strength and the confidence to know that what is right does not change simply because society deems it inconvenient. For older adults, this lesson is particularly relevant as they pass down values to younger generations. Leading by example, showing resilience in belief, and teaching the importance of self-respect are among the most powerful legacies one can leave behind. Karoline's story is a modern reflection of an age-old truth. Principles are only as strong as one's willingness to defend them. And in a world that increasingly demands compromise, the ability to hold steady is not just admirable, it is essential.